You know this man, or at least you think you do. The name invoked in boardrooms and on trading floors as the founding father of modern capitalism. The patron saint of greed is good, right? Well, this is a lie. Modern capitalism didn't adopt Adam Smith. It took his name, stripped his work of its moral heart, and repurposed him as a mascot for an ideology he would have found economically dangerous. Today, we're going to perform an autopsy on a hijacked legacy, and what we'll find is that the real Adam Smith wasn't a market mechanic. He was a moral philosopher who issued a series of dire warnings about the very system that now claims him as its godfather. To understand Smith, we must first forget the world we live in. Forget global markets, digital currencies, and shareholder reports. Smith's 18th century was a world dominated by blood-stained monopolies. The most powerful corporation on earth wasn't Apple or Amazon. It was the British East India Company, a private army with its own government, its own courts, and the power to wage war, collect taxes, and enslave entire populations. This was the reality of free trade in Smith's time, a brutal, state-sanctioned plunder dressed up as commerce. Smith watched this happen. He saw how merchants and manufacturers, driven by their own self-interest, would inevitably form what he called conspiracies against the public. His words were not gentle. He wrote that these groups are always and everywhere in a state of conspiracy, seeking to deceive and oppress the public. He didn't want the government to stay out of the way of these corporations. He wanted the government to act as a referee, a vigilant guardian whose sole job was to prevent these powerful entities from rigging the game. This is the first thread of our triple thread integration. The modern parallel is obvious. The East India Company is the historical mirror for today's tech giants and too-big-to-fail banks. They don't just compete in the market, they write the rules of the market. Smith's warning wasn't about too much regulation, it was about too little. Now, let's talk about the book everyone ignores. Before The Wealth of Nations, Smith wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and this is where the real Adam Smith lives. He believed that before any market can function, there must be a foundation of shared morality. He called this internal moral compass. Imagine it like this. Before you make a deal, before you set a price, before you sign a contract, a quiet voice inside you asks, could I look at this action through the eyes of a fair and disinterested third party and still find it just? If the answer is yes, the transaction is legitimate. If the answer is no, you are not a businessman. You are, in Smith's own words, a beast. This is the software that runs the market. Without it, trade is impossible. It's the reason you don't have to weigh every coin or inspect every product. You trust that the other person has an impartial spectator of their own. Apply this to the modern world. Can a CEO who knowingly sells addictive social media algorithms to children pass the test of the impartial spectator? Can a bank that bundles toxic loans and sells them as safe investments look at themselves in that moral mirror and feel clean? Smith's framework gives us the language to judge these actions not as complex financial engineering, but as simple, old-fashioned moral failures. Of course, no discussion of Smith is complete without the invisible hand. But here's the forensic truth. Smith used the phrase exactly 3 times in his entire body of work. And in none of those instances did he describe a benevolent force guiding the market toward the public good. The first time in a history of astronomy, he used it to describe an ancient superstition, the hand of Jupiter moving the planets. He was mocking irrational belief. The second time, in the theory of moral sentiments, he described how the rich, in their selfish pursuit of luxury, accidentally create jobs for the poor. Their gluttony leaves crumbs for others. The hand here is a description of an unintended consequence of greed, not a divine endorsement of it. The third and most famous use, in The Wealth of Nations, describes a merchant who, out of fear of foreign competition, invests his capital at home. This action, born of fear and self-preservation, unintentionally benefits the domestic economy. That's it. That's the full story of the invisible hand. It is never a policy directive. It is never a law of nature. It is always a description of an outcome that happens in spite of the actor's intentions, not because of them. The modern belief in a self-regulating, divinely guided market is a total fabrication, a complete inversion of Smith's meaning. He was describing human psychology, not economic theology. He wasn't just worried about corporate power or moral decay, he was terrified of what the new industrial economy would do to the human mind itself. He gave this fear a name: mental mutilation. He saw the factory system rising, the division of labor taken to its extreme. A man who spends his entire life making one pinhead over and over will lose his capacity for thought, creativity, and social connection. He becomes a husk, a machine part with a heartbeat. For Smith, this wasn't just a tragedy for the worker. It was a threat to the entire republic. A society of mentally mutilated citizens cannot be free. They cannot participate in democracy. They cannot be moral agents. His solution was radical for his time: state-funded public education, not as a charity, but as a necessary defense of the human spirit against the dehumanizing logic of pure efficiency. This is the core of his philosophy. He didn't want a free market for the sake of efficiency. He wanted it for the sake of human liberty, and he knew that liberty was impossible without an educated, whole, and morally aware populace. Today, this warning echoes in the soul-crushing nature of the gig economy, the burnout of bullshit jobs, and the anxiety of an AI future that promises to automate not just our labor, but our very sense of purpose. So how did this cautious, deeply ethical thinker become the poster child for deregulation? The answer lies in a deliberate campaign of historical revisionism. In the 20th century, during the Cold War and the rise of the Chicago School of Economics, a new Adam Smith was needed. A simple, market-friendly Smith. A Smith who could be quoted in a soundbite to justify tax cuts and corporate bailouts. They found him by editing him. They took the passages from The Wealth of Nations that praised self-interest and efficiency, ripped them from their moral context in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and declared the job done. We stand in 2026 at a crossroads. The East India Company has returned, not in ships and muskets, but in data centers and lobbying firms. The conspiracies against the public are more sophisticated than ever. The risk of mental mutilation is amplified by algorithms designed to capture our attention, not our intellect. The real Adam Smith doesn't offer us a simple solution. He doesn't tell us to trust the market. He tells us to trust something far more powerful: our own moral agency. He tells us to strengthen our impartial spectator, to demand that our corporations and our governments be held to a standard of justice, not just profit. To fight for an education system that creates whole human beings, not just efficient workers. His legacy isn't a set of economic laws, it's a challenge, a call to build an economy that serves humanity. The father of capitalism wasn't its biggest cheerleader, he was its most profound critic, and his warnings are more relevant today than they've ever been.